spouse Michael and I first started dating, a few weeks into our new relationship, we had our first fight. Now, the details no longer matter about what we were arguing about, but in essence it boiled down to I wanted to do something and he didn't want me to do it. Now, to clarify, Michael is in no way a controlling individual, and I do have an obstinate streak where I just don't like not being told to do something, but it wasn't actually a power struggle or power dynamic in that instance. But it was about whether or not it was okay for me to do something, because I thought it was fine and I didn't see any reason not to do it. Michael's reasoning was that it wasn't against any rules or anything like that, but it caused him harm. It caused him pain. So why would I do it if it caused him pain? Both of us needed to clear our heads and go seek wisdom from our wisers, and Michael reached out to one of his oldest, nearest best friends. Now, this best friend I had known before I knew Michael. We had worked together at MCC while I was working in the refugee sponsorship program. And so he knew me through that context. And so Michael and his friend went out for tea. Michael laid out the situation and his friend listened, and he said, well, what you need to understand about Laura is that she is deeply committed to principles and to fairness. And he was helping Mike see that that's how I was seeing the situation. What was fair? It wasn't fair for me not to do this thing because there was no good reason for me not to do it. But that wasn't the whole story, because my action would have caused pain to Michael. In the end, I didn't do the action that would have caused him pain. I admit, with a bit of kicking and fussing that lasted for a little while, I may have brought it up a few times, many times after that. But I didn't yet have a complete understanding of the role of love and compassion in relationship to fairness. Last week we talked about how Troy's sermons on non-judgment were messing with my head in a sense of how does it relate to justice. Believing that these two can live in harmony, but not really understanding how, because they feel like they're diametrically opposed, but with a deep theological hunch in my bones that they're not, just not understanding how they go together. Here's the thing, lots of conversations I have with people around judgment and justice, we jump right to here of, well, here's how you do it. But here's how I see it right now for where we're going to talk today. Here's the wall. From the wall out into the room, we're all pretty clear on that. I haven't really in my world run into a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, just, let injustice go by. What that looks like in practice, of course, is a lot of variation of, but from here out, we're pretty clear on that. Here's how I see it though. The wall and the framework of the house, I don't build things, but the framework of the house is the non-duality, the non-judgment. And what I want to understand is what happens in the space in between here. What is that foundational premise that we then go from the wall out into justice in our daily lives? So what then is love? We haven't done a great job in the Western tradition with defining love. Richard Rohr, the Jesuit priest that I was talking about last week, I recommend his books and his sermons. He says that we regularly just use love as a synonym for nice. Be nice to people. He also says you won't find the word nice anywhere in the Bible, but you do find the word love a lot. So what is love? And why does it matter that we get the definition correct? Well, love is the very nature of God, according to the Bible. The Trinity is the constant outpouring and inpouring of love, unstoppable, continuous, for eternity, amongst the Trinity. And we are drawn into the work of the Trinity and then sent out with that indwelled love. So if we are built in the image of God, which is what Genesis says, and the nature of God is love, then we are built in the image of love. This is fundamental to the questions of justice and non-duality. Love is our deepest, truest self. And throughout this whole sermon conversation, anytime I say the word love, I want you to picture it with a capital L, love. This isn't reference to the shoes you love or the ice cream you love or even the spouse that you love. Those are all wonderful things. But this is an eternal, theological, cosmic love. And it's in us. It is the very fiber and nature of who we are and our being. This is crucial. This is fundamental. Richard Rohr says, and I quote, "When you miss this definition of love, you become moralistic. The only way to prove that I'm loving is to be moral. And the irony is that it makes you less loving because you're highly judgmental." Love, being our truest, deepest self, means that it is not the occasional moral decision that we make. It is the very essence of our DNA, what makes us human, what makes us all who we are and what we are, which is beloved children of God. Our Anabaptist theology teaches us that that which is deepest in us is the image of God, love, and that sin or brokenness can obscure this, but it can never erase it from who you are or what you are. And it can never be erased from any other living human being. That means that every single living human is an equally beloved child of God. We're going to come back to this. What does it mean for everyone around us to be loved by God? Gandhi was the first to coin the phrase satyagraha, which is a term and concept that is fundamental to nonviolent movements. He used two words, satya, which means truth, and agraha, which means holding fiercely to or deep commitment to imply a movement that was unequivocally, intrinsically tied to a dedication to holding on to truth. And he always wrote truth with a capital T, truth. This is a quote from Gandhi. "Truth, or satya, implies love, and firmness, agraha, serves as a synonym for force. I thus began to call the Indian movement satyagraha, that is to say, the force which is born of truth and love, or nonviolence. Hatred has no place in satyagraha and is a positive breach of its ruling principle." It's funny because I was thinking about satyagraha this week, and I watched with my family Star Wars Episode 1, and Yoda warns young Anakin, be careful of his fear, because fear leads to anger, and anger leads to hatred, and hatred leads to suffering. Now, you might say that, well, it's just Star Wars, but that's actually an ancient wisdom that was not just formulated by George Lucas for the Star Wars series. In fact, this is my fun party trick that I learned in grad school. Yoda, the name, comes from the Hebrew word yada, which means to know. George Lucas was Jewish, and he inscribed a ton of the Torah and Jewish mysticism into the Star Wars series. Now, my children inform me that is neither cool nor a party trick, but I beg to differ. So now you've got that cool party trick up your sleeve too. The Archbishop of the American Episcopal Church, Michael Curry, agrees with Yoda, though I can't say personally for sure whether or not he knows that or whether he's ever actually seen the Star Wars series, though I think it's highly probable. But he was asked recently in an interview on Being on NPR what it meant to be an archbishop and a black man in America during the Black Lives Matter movement. And he answered by saying, and I quote, "Justice by itself is not enough. Read Micah. Justice without love turns into revenge, and that is not the way of God. That is not the social change we want. That is not something that reflects the kingdom, the beloved community." And what is that famous Micah quote that he's referring to? Well, of course, it's Micah 6:8. "What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." I believe that in that Micah passage is the binding agent for how we reconcile justice and non-judgment. Micah says, walk justly, there's the justice, love mercy, love compassion, and walk humbly, that'd be non-duality, to start with the yes and rather than the yes or. Put another way, it's not a dualistic situation. It's not justice on the one hand and non-judgment on the other hand, but there's a third essential part. You must have three pillars: justice, non-judgment, and love. As Reverend Michael Curry says, you can't have just justice. Justice by itself is not enough. Non-judgment by itself is not enough. Love is the matter that fuses the two together. And as a matter of fact, fear is the matter that divides. Fear is what causes pain and suffering. Fear of the other. Fear, which turns to anger, which turns to hatred, which turns to suffering. Your own and those of others. John 4:7 says, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is of God, and those who do not love do not know God." Why? Because God is love. Not love is God. God is love. And if we live in God, then we'll find ourselves in relationship with God and with others. Understanding this necessarily leads to asking yourself the question, how then shall I live? Who do I want to be? What do I want my life to look like? What do I want my legacy to be? Which naturally leads to, what way are you going to follow? Who are you going to follow? As Christians, we say that we are followers of Jesus, but so rarely do we actually understand what that means. I was just talking about Gandhi a moment ago, and one of his most famous quotes is, "I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians. They are so unlike your Christ." The way of Jesus is not easy. It's about being constantly and permanently aligned with the greater good, with unselfish giving, with service, with becoming the way of life. To choose the way of Jesus is not easy. It is to constantly align yourself with and choose to follow the path of sacrificial love, the greater good, and becoming the way of life for yourself and for others. It also means that if you say that you truly believe in the ways of Jesus, then by necessity you must believe in the image of God in all others, not just the ones like you, and not just the ones you like. It requires acknowledging their deepest, truest self, which again is the image of God, which is love. There's a famous story of Gandhi walking with one of his best friends, the Reverend Charles Andrews, on a crowded street in South Africa. And there was some kind of like rough, angry-looking young men who started following them and were clearly sending off some aggressive vibes. And his priest friend commented that perhaps it was time for them to leave the street, that it looked like something bad was about to go down. And Gandhi says to him, "But doesn't your Jesus teach to turn the other cheek?" And the Reverend says, rather nervously, "Well, yes, but I think that's more metaphorical." And Gandhi keeps walking and says, "I'm not so sure. I think that what Jesus is talking about is the deepest, truest self in others and in yourself. That if you act out of your deepest, truest self, then that calls forth in them their deepest, truest self, and they'll respond to you in kind." Now, Gandhi wasn't naive. He spent something like 12 years of his life in British prisons. He witnessed horrific acts of atrocity and brutality. He lived through riots and murders. He knew that people were capable of incredible suffering for each other. But he would describe this as, because there's some dirty sand in the ocean, it does not taint the ocean, and that humanity is the ocean. World War I caught Canadian Mennonites unprepared. It'd been a long time since most of them had lived in a land with war or oppression, and so their articulation of their pacifist ideals had gotten pretty rusty by that time, and they had to scramble really quickly to try and explain to the Canadian government why their sons should be exempt from the draft, when they no longer were really good, frankly, at putting it succinctly or clearly why they believed in nonviolence from a biblical perspective. By the end of the war, they'd gotten a lot better at it, but that was 100 years ago, and I think the same is true with Mennonites today. I think that most of us can't articulate clearly why we believe in nonviolence, except maybe as a social justice movement or a positive political movement, but very few Mennonites anymore can tie it to theology. I mentioned my Old Testament professor last week. This week I'll mention my former New Testament professor, Tom Yoder-Neufeld, whom I have the highest respect for. And he would often say that he worries about Mennonites' pacifism, that when you tie it to a social zeitgeist of good, then when the times change, you'll lose the pacifism. Whereas when it's tied to a deep-rooted theology of all human beings being the sacred children of God, with the image of God indwelling within them, then that will remain whether it is a popular opinion or not. We're probably all familiar with the stories of the early Anabaptists going to their tortured death, literally vocally praying for those who were killing them in the moment. I acknowledge, I don't think that would be me in the moment. So I think it's really important that we deeply understand, study, and choose to live by the values that we proclaim, and that they no longer remain moral choices that you make in the moment. That we understand nonviolence as not simply not signing up for war or refusing to shoot somebody, but in peaceful relations, positive peace, as Gandhi understood it and practiced it, with all of our lives. So, I have a little refresher for us today. This is from Third Way Cafe and their nonviolent guide, which is synthesized from a Herald Press publication from 1980. The fundamentals of nonviolence require that we have justice and non-judgment, or call it humility, bonded with love, or call it mercy. I've synthesized the list into 5, and I don't have them memorized, though I do try to live by them. 1. God calls us to imitate Jesus. Jesus was called the Prince of Peace, and this doesn't mean that he walked around in a white flowy robe. Remember that he was known for flipping tables and driving people out with a whip at one point. But it does mean that we love our enemies. And again, let's remember what love means. Love your enemy, pray for your persecutor, and do good to those who hurt you. But also seek justice. Pacifism is not passive. It comes from the Latin word for peace, and peace is active, particularly if you're in a position where you can speak with people or for people who are voiceless. Leverage that privilege we've talked about. And it also means that, like Jesus, you're willing to suffer for the truth. Number 2, pacifism not being passive means that you serve others, that you offer mercy and forgiveness, that you seek justice. It makes the list twice, so it shows you how important it is and fundamental. And that you seek reconciliation. Reconciliation with your family, with your community, and internationally, that our first allegiance is not to our nation, but to God. 100 years ago, it was the practice in Mennonite churches hereabouts and elsewhere that they would not hold a communion service until all was reconciled with every member in the congregation. And sometimes it get postponed for months or even years until every member of the congregation, that is every member of the body, could acknowledge that they were right with every other member of the body. That did not mean that they all agreed on everything, but it meant a self-sacrificing love. It meant thinking of the common good and the greater good and not just your own needs and wants. Number 3, that God created all people and that Jesus died for all people and that therefore all people, get this? All people, not just the ones that we like or who do good things, have inherent value, that they are all the sacred children of God and that which indwells deepest in them is the image of God. So therefore, we extend love to all people. We reach out to all people's true selves with our true selves, even if they are not acting in their true self. The famous Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh writes extensively on compassion for criminals and why it is so fundamental. And he says that to kill a person for committing a crime doesn't really bring about justice because it doesn't heal the person causing the crime. The true justice has to see the deepest true self in all people and try and heal that which is broken in them. 4, that because Jesus' kingdom is both present and future, we don't seek revenge. And it is God's job, not ours, to judge. This is part of why I believe that justice and non-judgment are so tied to love. Because while there is absolutely violence in the Bible, the Anabaptist theology around that violence largely sort of boils down to, at the end of the day, it's God's to judge. It's God's to choose, and never ours, because we are on an equal playing field with all of God's children. None of us are above any others. And 5, that peace involves all aspects of our life. Our job choices, our economy, our family, creation care, international relations, political voting, money management, all things. I remember Arnold Snyder, the Anabaptist historian, saying to me once that Anabaptists are really good at declaring themselves to be nonviolent, and therefore they make the momentary moral choices of not signing up for war or not joining the police force. But he said, but are we at peace in our families? Are we at peace with our spouses, with our children? And peace in all of life means concern for all people in all circumstances. This requires a great deal of compassion. It's true what they say that hurt people hurt people. It's why Thich Nhat Hanh so focuses with his work with criminals on understanding why they became criminals. No baby begins as a murderer, so what happened down their life to cause that ultimate of division, that ultimate expression of fear to anger, to hate, to suffering? This is where I believe that our modern human rights movement often strays from truth and love, that we seek to heal in the manner of oppression, that we cancel people rather than greeting them with love and compassion. So in practice, this means when someone engages in a harmful act, you must discern what it means to act in love, in compassion in that moment. My original story of Mike's and my first argument, I was acting in justice, but I wasn't acting in love and compassion. And as Michael Curry pointed out, it doesn't lead to the kind of positive social change that we're seeking. I so often say, if your goal is to be right, then by all means call people out in cancel culture. But if your goal is to heal the brokenness in the world, to see positive peace, to see oppression cease, and justice flow down from the mountaintops, then we have to use a different way. Now, it's very important that I acknowledge that this philosophy has been massively abused. It's been used to encourage women in the church to stay in abusive relationships, to hide sexual abuse, to do all kinds of harm to people who needed justice. I believe the answer here is to keep it back to fundamentals. What is love? What is the nature of love? There's no way to reconcile the idea of God's divine love with a woman being forced to stay in an abusive marriage. I believe this requires to stay on the way of justice and non-judgment and love. I believe it is essential that we stick to the fundamentals. What is love? There is no way to reconcile hatred or oppression or abuse with God's nature of love. To do so is to perform an act of violence, even if you never raise your hand. So let me end with this quote from Reverend Michael Curry. How we treat one another really is a reflection of what we think of God.